Hey, what's going on, everyone? Thank you so much for joining us as we walk you through everything you need to know to beat daily fantasy football in 2020. My name is Andy Baldacci. I'm the CEO of SaberSim, and I'm joined by DFS pros, SaberSim partners, and twin brothers, Max and Danny Steinberg. How's it going, guys?
It's done really great.
Jinx.
So here's what we're going to cover today. Basically, I'm going to first cover the secret of winning lineups, and Danny's going to really dig into those secrets. Next, we're going to talk about the coronavirus impacts, how it's going to adjust the season, how you should think about it and prepare for what, compared to other sports like baseball and basketball, might not be as weird, but there are still certain things you need to keep in mind. Next, we're going to talk about the research shortcut, and then we're going to show you how to put it all together. We're going to walk through step by step exactly what you need to do to take this content and use that to build better lineups. So why don't we just jump right into it? Danny, what is the secret of winning lineups?
Yeah, so the secret of winning lineups, it's all about upside, because the most popular daily fantasy tournaments have a very top-heavy payout structure, meaning 20 to 30% of the prize pool is going to go to first place. You want to have those lineups that have the most upside, that are able to beat out a whole bunch of players to unlock the returns of the top-heavy payout structure. And what are the elements of upside? Correlation, ownership, and variance. And so what are these things? What is correlation? Correlation is just how players' performances move together, whether that's players on the same team or players in opposite teams. So in your lineups, you want to maximize positive correlation so that when one player in your lineup does well, a lot of other players are more likely to do well as well, and you want to minimize negative correlation so you don't have two players on the same team who cut into each other's upside. In football, the strongest correlations are between the QB and basically any pass catchers on the team. Mostly that's going to be wide receivers and tight ends, but also sometimes that's running backs, like Chris Thompson or Alvin Kamara or Austin Eckler or Christian McCaffrey. Those are all running backs who catch a lot of passes and do end up having pretty high correlations to the QBs as well. Someone like Josh Jacobs, or a running back that doesn't catch a lot of passes, that's not going to have as strong a correlation to the QB, but there is a small positive correlation there. The different attributes of all players have kind of different attributes that are going to make them more or less correlated to other players on the same team. And that's something SaberSim picks up on really, really well, and a lot better than heuristics or rules of thumb are going to be able to do. And Max is going to get into that more in a few minutes. Players on opposing teams tend to have small positive correlations to basically players on opposing teams have small positive correlations to each other. So that the reason that is because when one team scores a whole lot of points, the other team has to pass a lot to catch up, and therefore you see them have more plays and get more fantasy points in general. Opposing running backs are like extremely game script dependent. If a team is up a lot of points, they're going to run it a lot more. And if they're down a lot of points, they're not going to run it at all. So running backs on opposing teams tend to be negatively correlated to each other, and running backs and defenses on the same team tend to have positive correlations. So what does this mean for stacking? Well, in general, in optimal lineups, you're going to have probably a QB and a pass catcher, or possibly two or three pass catchers. You can maybe a QB with two wide receivers at tight end, QB, two wide receivers, running back, maybe just a QB, a wide receiver, and a running back. And you'll also tend to put or you'll be inclined to see a wide receiver or a tight end on the opposite team as well. And that's sort of, in those lineups, you kind of tend to get these general game stack lineups where, because pass catchers on opposing teams have small positive correlations, game stacking does tend to make a lot of sense. And you'll see SaberSim, because of the simulations and because of the correlations you have, you'll see a lot of lineups where you have sort of game stacked lineups.
And The second part about upside that you mentioned is ownership. And so first, can you just kind of explain for people that might not be as familiar with the concept, just first what that means, and then talk about how that applies to NFL, if it's a sport where you should fade the chalk or avoid the highly owned players, or just what your approach should be there.
Yeah, so ownership is just in a given contest, what percent of lineups a given player is in. So like sometimes a player will be very popular and you'll see them maybe get like 50 or be in 50 or 60% of lineups. And ownership can be important because it can be good to in tournaments to try to leverage that ownership and either fade people who are very high owned if they have a good enough chance of having a bad game, or trying to find someone who's low owned who has really high upside. That can be important as well.
Can you touch us quickly on why ownership even matters? Like why are these things we should be paying attention to? What are we trying to accomplish by playing some of these under the radar plays or things like that?
Yeah, so I mean, the basically, like, if you have a guy in your lineup who's really high owned and he has a really, really good game, that's gonna be okay for your expected value in a tournament, but it's not gonna be. You're gonna have a lot of other lineups you're competing against who has the same player, so it's not that great. While if you have a low owned guy who has a really, really good game, if he's low owned, by definition, that means there's not a whole lot of other lineups that have him, and therefore you have a better chance of kind of having a lineup that does a lot better than the field.
Yeah, and also I just want to add, conversely, if you don't have someone that a lot of people have and that player does badly, that's really good for you as well, right? Like sometimes you'll notice like, oh, I had a really good lineup tonight and I feel like it didn't score much. And that's usually because the chalk fails. And so staying away from those chalk plays that end up not doing very well can be really important.
And then, Danny, when it comes to injury risk, obviously that's like a much bigger thing to pay attention to in NFL than in, say, baseball, in terms of like mid-game injuries, people getting taken out of the game. How does that play into all of this?
Yeah, so NFL probably has more injuries than any other sport, and because of that, I think it's a sport where you can feel a lot more comfortable fading high-owned plays. That's especially the case with like running backs who tend to get injured a lot and who tend to have more injury risk. NFL also has like a fair amount of variance in player projection. So really, there's like on a week-to-week basis, almost anything can happen. And it's just because someone's going to be like 50 or 60% owned and it seems like, oh my God, they're locked to have a great game. Oftentimes those players can have bad games.
And kind of building on that idea of variance, when it does come to variance, how should that be impacting how we're thinking about how we're diversifying our own lineups and kind of thinking about like our own internal ownership?
Yeah, so I think what the different positions have different variances. Wide receiver tends to be the highest variance position. So you're going to find more plays that may not have a lot of ownership that have high upside and the ability to have like a large amount of fantasy points. Running backs, because they're so impacted by injuries and because they're such a volume dependent position, you're often going to find running backs who are starting for the team that has a bunch of running back injuries, who are going to play a lot and have too low of a salary, that you'll end up getting in a large amount of lineups. And that could make sense in a lot of weeks. Sometimes there are running backs that are so high projected and have such a low salary that you're just naturally going to get them in a lot of lineups. But for most of the other positions, you're going to see a lot more diversity in your lineups, or it's more optimal to get some more diversity there.
And then when it just comes to upside in general, we've talked a lot about kind of the specifics and given a lot of examples, but are there any other pieces of upside that are unique to football that you want to just mention before we move on?
Yeah, I think in general, you want the people who are going to be able to get the long touchdowns, wide receivers who get really deep targets down the field, players who are very fast in general, like someone like Saquon Barkley or Tyreek Hill. those kind of players who are really fast and get those super long touchdowns are going to be the highest upside plays. Game stacking and getting a lot of players in like a very high scoring game, those tend to have like very high scoring games tend to be high upside events because you see more plays and you see one team possibly get a lot of passing touchdowns and the opposing team have to pass like 50 times and have a lot of receptions and passing touchdowns as well.
Yeah, and so there's a lot to kind of take in there, and in a little bit, Max is going to walk through exactly how to take all those pieces of advice that Danny shared and use that to actually build strong lineups. But before we get to that, though, while what we've just talked about really applies in any season for football, this is still kind of a weird year. They're not playing in a bubble. There aren't as many issues as baseball may have faced, but there are still going to be some impacts from coronavirus that you need to think about as you're playing DFS. And so, Max, do you want to just kind of touch on what some of these impacts may be and how people can adapt to that?
Yeah, so I think we don't have a lot of certainty here. We don't know what's going to happen, right? We know with baseball, there's been a lot of games canceled. We know in basketball, there are some games postponed more because of social justice things, but still, there's a lot of unknown. And so I think you want to be really vigilant with the news, especially an hour and a half before games when we get those active and inactive lists that you'll probably see on everyone's Twitter or just you have to search for it. It's very easy to find. Or you can go to our Slack channel. And if you see those actives and inactives, you want to pay close attention because there are going to be people who are inactive that you were not expecting. And it's going to be important to adjust your projections accordingly given to what's happening. Also, just keep in mind for afternoon games, be vigilant. If there's possibly a game cancellation, make sure that you're around to be able to do those swaps. And then the other thing that I think is possible is there might be more passing because there's no crowds. There's going to be crowd noise that's pumped in. It's only going to be about 70 decibels. It's not going to be that loud. It's going to allow road teams to be able to hear things more. There's going to be less false starts. They're going to feel more comfortable passing. And I think you're going to see more success passing for road teams and just more passing in general. So it's just something to keep an eye out and maybe be a little high on road team passing at the beginning of the season.
Yeah, and I think we'll just kind of see how it all plays out. I think in the first weeks, especially kind of going on that potentially more passing route, that kind of hypothesis you have could be a good edge there because we'll see what happens and people may adjust later on. But going in with that could be pretty good. But really the big message is just stay on top of the news, stay on top of what's happening. It's not going to be as necessarily set and forget as it had been in the past. But with all that said, let's kind of jump right into the meat of things and talk a little bit about what actually goes into building lineups with all this information. So, Max, you want to take over and share your screen?
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, most of us are balancing DFS with a job, a family, and really just everything else we have going on in life. And so while football does make it a little bit easier and a little bit more manageable for us by just being a weekly sport compared to something like baseball or basketball that's every single day, that doesn't mean that we can just spend all of our weekend doing research and building our lineups. But with that in mind, when we're looking at a huge list of players, it's hard to know where to even begin. And so we built SaberSim to make it easy for you to build winning lineups fast. And one of the ways that we do that is by making it easy to figure out where to spend your time researching, regardless of how much time you actually have. We've worked with some of the top names in DFS, two of which I actually have with me here today, Max and Danny, as well as Giant Squid. And we've built and refined a one-of-a-kind simulator that takes dozens of performance predictors and simulates every single game, play-by-play, thousands of times. And it's this unique process that gives us data that allows us to just automate away a lot of the busy work that traditional DFS tools bog you down with so you can spend your limited amount of time where it matters most. And if you want to win at daily fantasy football and you just can't spend all weekend researching, building lineups, whatever else it is, then you have to focus on a small number of players and teams that are going to have the biggest impact on the slate. And the absolute fastest way to do this is by doing a test build in SaberSim just to see who we're naturally high or low on so you don't have to research that entire slate. And so we're not going to make any adjustments here or set any rules, anything like that. All we're going to do is create a new build and tell SaberSim the contest that we're entering for. So Max has already put this in, and what we're doing right now is we're building for the 20 max play action on DraftKings. It has something like 200,000 entries. And by putting that information in, SaberSim kind of takes all that and says, okay, based on what we know about this kind of contest, about the slate, about the players, about everything else, we're going to set the defaults for you to have them already dialed in for that type of contest. So you're getting the right amount of upside. You're not getting too much risk, but you're getting the right amount of risk for the contest that you're entering. And if you were to try to do this with a traditional optimizer without setting any rules, without making any groups, or just spending a ton of time dialing things in, you would frankly just get really bad lineups because those optimizers simply do not understand upside. And that's why you have to spend so much time programming them. But because we're simulating every single game thousands of times, we have the data that lets us understand and quantify upside and give you strong lineups right out of the box. And so our goal here is with this test build is just to see what players and teams SaberSim is high or low on so we can focus our research there. And the more time you have available, the more players and teams you should look into. But regardless of the amount of time you have, this is going to make sure that you're able to focus it on the areas that have the biggest impact. So again, if all you have is 20, 30 minutes, that's fine. Pick out a few players, pick out a few teams and focus there. If you do have a few hours, cast a wider net and go from there. But now that we've got this lineup pool built, Max, do you want to jump in and just kind of walk through how you would look at this player pool?
Yeah, so I think the overall theme here is twofold. One is we're looking for ways to add value to the build process and then doing quality control at the end in the post-build process to really hone in our lineups. So I'm going to focus right now on the adding value part. So as Andy said, we are just trying to focus in on the players that the SaberSim lineup builder is showing us and then checking and seeing, okay, is there something that I'm seeing or I can find that means that these players should be higher or lower than what SaberSim is saying, right? So I'm just going to look through through some of the players we're getting.
Do you want to first just expand the lineup a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and do that. But one thing that's sticking out to me already is Matt Ryan, Tyrod Taylor. So we have Atlanta passing game and Chargers offense as a whole. We get a lot of Austin Eckler. We get a lot of Calvin Ridley. So that's Atlanta passing game. We have some Keenan Allen. We get a lot of Hunter Henry. And so those are things that are going to want to check. And so, SaberSim uses historical data to build their models. And there's a lot of ways where that historical data is not going to be totally accurate, whether it's a coaching change, someone playing through an injury, some sort of weather situation that sort of screwed up the historical data to make some team look more run heavy. There's a lot of ways that context can shape the historical data in a way we're not going to pick up. And I think especially with, coaching changes, players changing teams, sometimes it's really hard, right? So if we look back at SaberSim and we go to the detailed projections and look at quarterback, I'm going to look at the Chargers offense first. And we look at Tyrod Taylor and we're seeing in terms of raw passing yards, he's the fourth highest quarterback on the slate. To me, that seems a little off for a few reasons. One is Tyrod Taylor's on a new team. He is a running quarterback. And I'm not sure that he's going to be that strong in the passing game. And we can look at some free tools to sort of see, is, this not as strong of a play as it seems? And I think in general, if you look at Football Outsiders, they have this great pace stats. And you can see that the Chargers are actually the slowest paced team in the league. And they do not have a coaching change. And that says to me that Tyrod Taylor probably is going to be one of the slowest paced QBs in the league. And for me, that says, okay, I don't think he's going to do as well as SaberSim suggests in the passing game. So I'm going to lower him. I'm going to lower Austin Eckler a little bit. I'm going to lower Keenan Allen a bit. And I'm going to lower Hunter Henry a little bit because I feel like we're over-projecting this passing game. For Atlanta, one thing that stands out to me is if we look at their wide receivers, we have Calvin Ridley actually over Julio Jones. Now, that's a strong take, and I'm sure also just estimating, target share before the season, these numbers might adjust slightly, so you might see something different when you end up going to SaberSim. before Thursday or Friday or Saturday. But let's just look at some of their stats last season and see if we can see anything that might say something contrary, right? That seems a little strange. So this is a website. It's called airyards.com. I basically go to it every week. It's started by this very smart guy, Josh Hermsmeyer. And he discovered that basically a really good indicator of a wide receiver performance from week to week isn't just how much they're getting targeted, but how far down the field they're getting targeted and what percentage of the targets of the team they're getting. So what I like to do is just look at the last 4 relevant weeks of the season. So we're going to exclude 17 because maybe there's something weird there, and just look at some of these opportunity stats that Josh has on his site. And as you can see, Julio Jones rates really high. And if we compare his WORPR or Whopper numbers to the rest of the league.
What is the Whopper, by the way?
Whopper, it's a combination of target share and air yards.
It's weighted opportunity.
Yeah, so it's just basically not only what the target share was, but how far this player was targeted down the field.
Okay.
So Julio Jones has a really high Whopper. This is the highest in the league. This says to me that I think he should be better than Calvin Ridley. So I'm going to adjust these numbers. I'm going to adjust Calvin Ridley down because he's actually, I think, projected as one of the highest wide receivers on the slate. And I might project Julio Jones up a little bit, right? So that's why there's a couple ways that we're going to, look at these projections. And then there's also stuff that has to do with injuries, right? We're thinking, okay, what is there a player who's going through an injury? Is there a coaching change we like? And for me, that's Cleveland, right? Because one piece of information we know is Odell Beckham Jr., who's a very talented wide receiver, obviously a big name. You don't have to have deep knowledge of football.
I know that. Yeah.
He played through a core muscle injury last season, and he did not have a very good season. So our historical data is going to evaluate him in that way and be like, okay, Odell Beckham Jr. is not very good, or not as good as we think. Well, wait a second. If he is playing through an injury, that says to me he probably is going to regress back to his normal, amazing self this season. Not only that, is Cleveland has a coaching change. They have gone from maybe the worst coach in the NFL to a very solid coach in Kevin Stefanski. And so I'm going to be bullish on Cleveland in general to start the season. And SaberSim has a really cool way of actually doing this so you don't have to actually go through each player and do this in a smarter way, is we allow you to adjust projections on a team level, right? So we have Cleveland at scoring about 20 points against Baltimore. That seems pretty low to me. I would probably have them closer to maybe 22 points. So we can just raise their team projection and apply those changes. And SaberSim is going to now evaluate the game differently. It's going to evaluate the game as if Cleveland is going to score 22 points. And that works in 2 ways. Not only is it going to adjust Cleveland's projections, as we see here, we see Odell Beckham Jr. has a higher projection, Baker Mayfield has a higher projection, all these players have higher projection. Baltimore is also influenced differently. As Danny was saying, if you're projected to be up in the game, that means you're going to run more. Well, we're saying that Cleveland is probably going to keep this game a little closer. So that means that guys like Mark Andrews might do a little better, Marquise Brown might do a little better, and Mark Ingram might do a little worse, right? That makes sense. So I think this is another really great way to use SaberSim's ways of adjusting to add value in a way that's quicker and it's actually going to be more accurate.
Yeah, this is something that, so Max, I just want to stop right there because I feel like this is something we really want to emphasize, where a lot of times it can be, you might have a strong feeling about a game or about a team or whatever it may be. And then you're like, well, crap, now I have to go through a half dozen players on each team or more and make these adjustments. And like, that's going to take up all the time that you have. And so that's why kind of Max has gone through this way of looking at it, where you're looking at the players individually, and then you're looking for the trends and the teams, so that with the teams, with the data that we have, we make it really easy to make those broader adjustments so that you can get what you're looking for really quickly without having to go player by player and just tweaking this, tweaking that. You can just say, I think this game's going to be faster pace. I think this team's going to score more, whatever it may be, and get those changes in there very quickly. And so, Max, what did you do while I was kind of rambling on there?
Yeah. So I just actually started a new build because I think we've now made these adjustments and we're going to build lineups again, see again what SaberSim gives us. And depending on how much time you have, right? We're going to go back and forth and look at other players that we're getting a lot, make adjustments there, and try to perfect the projections and add as much value as possible to the projections as we possibly can, right? And so depending on how much time you have, you might go back and forth quite a bit. And you might do research without even doing this, right? Like, I spend a lot of time doing research throughout the week. And so without even looking at the build, I'm going to be adjusting a lot of players up and down. But this is a great way to just basically hone in on, okay, which players do I need to focus on? And okay, now that I focus on these players, are there any other players to focus on? Okay, go back and forth a bit. And then finally, you're going to have your projections honed in. And then after you're done with that, we're just going to go into what I call the quality control process, right? So let's say we're making 20 lineups. So I'm going to adjust this back to 20. What we're going to do is use all the features that SaberSim has to just make sure that we're getting the amount of diversity we want, the amount of stack types we want, the amount of game stacks we want, and try to make it spread it around a little bit so we can lower the variance we have from week to week a little bit and just make sure that we're doing some things. So one thing that I think is a really cool feature that we have is you can adjust exposure by stack type, right? So Danny talked about earlier about game stacking, right? And we show you what lineups have game stacking. So you see this little vertical line here. If there's a vertical line followed by a number, that means there is a game stack in the lineup. So maybe you really like just having a game stack every time.
And just backing up a little bit, the number beyond, like past the vertical line, is how many players you have on the opposing team, right?
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. So maybe you're like, okay, I want mostly game stacks, but 25% of your lineups is a QB with 2 skill position players. Okay, well, we can just lower the max exposure there, and then maybe just zero out this random 3 with no QB. And then we have more game stacks, and we have less just normal stacks. Or maybe you like specifically having, a QB with 2 receivers and 2 players from the opposing team. You can raise this min exposure. You can also do this with team stacks. We are getting a lot of Atlanta. Maybe you like Atlanta. You want to keep these projections as they are, but it's 30 minutes before lock. You just want to get these lineups in. We can just lower our exposure to Atlanta by capping that max exposure. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be doing is I'm trying to get more diversity and trying to just sort of spread it around a little bit more. I'm usually not raising the min exposure that much because if we're not getting a player that we want, that usually says to me, I either need to adjust his projection and go back and see if that projection is right. And if it's not, then I'm just going to leave him out of the lineup. There might be some reason that isn't intuitive that we're not getting a lineup, or maybe it's clear the player just isn't high projected enough given his price, right? And so you can make all these adjustments. You can even zero out some players that you just don't want in your lineups that you maybe want to take a stand of. And you can do this with game stacks as well, spread it around a bit. And that's basically it. And then you have your lineups, you can download them, and you can export them into DraftKings or Fanduel. It's really a pretty quick process. It shouldn't take that much time. And this is basically the process. Usually I'm building my lineups an hour before game time and feeling pretty comfortable with it because SaberSim has a lot of tools that allow you to just have a lot of easy, quick control like this.
Yeah, and I think what Max touched on is really important, where it's the process doesn't really change much no matter how much time you have, where he might be going in and truly like he is a professional, so he has a bit more time on his hands than the rest of us do, but like he's probably going in with a bit more research just in advance and is probably looking into most of the players before he's building his lineups. But regardless of that, the actual building process of doing the test build, of making some adjustments to projections, doing another build, and kind of repeating that process to really refine it, that's the exact same thing that you should be doing. And then you can just adapt how many times you're kind of going through it, how often, how many players you're looking at, how many times you're repeating the process, and just based on how much time you have available. When you're ready, you get to this last stage, and that's where you can really just dial in the exposures, save the lineups, and submit them. So there's a ton of power here, but that being said, we know there are other tools out there. So we're going to wrap up by just kind of sharing really what come down to the 6 secrets of daily fantasy football that apply regardless of what you're doing. These just apply, frankly, across the board. So, Max, do you mind if I take back over the screen? All right. So, in summary, these are the 6 secrets to beating NFL. Number 1, perfecting your projections.
Yeah, I think this means taking the foundation we're giving you, doing research, adjusting it, and making sure your projections are as good as possible, which is the most fun part of doing this.
Yeah, it's really everything comes from those projections. Those are the foundation that you're building upon. And so without getting those dialed in, you're just kind of making arbitrary adjustments. And that's why we've kind of built our lineup process around that. But regardless, no matter what tools you're using, get those projections dialed in. Number 2, paying attention to injuries.
Yeah, I mean, I think NFL, as more than any other sport, you're going to be doing a lot of reading. You're going to be doing a lot of keeping tabs on beat writers. You want to do the research and see what the coaches are saying, because you want to see who might try to get an edge that way, who might play more than expected, who might play less than expected.
And especially this season where there may be some injuries that aren't as expected just due to COVID and due to everything else. So you really want to keep attention on those types of things. The third one is taking advantage of free data. And Max, I know you touched on a few sources, but can you just expand on this one a little bit?
Yeah, I think football, more than any other sport, has so much good free resources. I mean, I think part of my research process sometimes is just keeping tabs on people on Twitter that I respect who will, post good research, blogs, airyards.com, as we talked about. There's so much free stuff, and it's so easy to access. You don't need to pay for a tout or anything. There's a lot of good stuff. Use that to your advantage.
Number 4, get your diversity through the quarterback.
Yeah, and so I think SaberSim, you're going to see this sort of naturally as you're building lineups, is the best way to diversify your lineups is starting with the quarterback position. And that's because the quarterback obviously has a lot of correlations to a lot of players on the team. And so what's going to end up happening is, if you want to diversify, how you can start is you change your quarterback, and suddenly the optimal lineup for that quarterback is going to be wildly different than another quarterback. And so getting a lot of diversity with good quarterbacks is going to be a way to make great lineups without sacrificing too much.
Number 5, find the upside. I'm going to mix it up and jump over to Danny on this one, the king of upside. What are the areas that people should be looking at for this?
Yeah, so get those fast players, get wide receivers that have high depths of target, that get targets way down the field. You want to make lineups that take advantage of all the strong positive correlations between different players, and also minimize the negative correlations you have in your lineups. And SaberSim does that naturally in the lineup building process.
And the last one is just using the right tools. And I know that we said we would cover all these principles in a way that didn't tie back to SaberSim. And really, all these things do apply regardless of the tools that you may be using. But frankly, they are just going to be way harder to use if you're using the wrong tools. And in our opinion, the only right tool is SaberSim, because we built this from the ground up to understand upside and to give you lineups out of the box that comprehend that take all those factors into consideration, that look at correlations, that look at ownership, that look at variance, and build lineups around that, geared towards the exact contests that you're building for. And it's not as though just out of the box you're going to start printing money by clicking a few buttons. We've shown you what goes into it, and there's always going to be a little bit of work on your part, or a lot of bit of work, just depending on how much time you have. And we've just built this process around the idea of saying, okay, however much time you have, we want you to be able to focus that time on the things that matter most, rather than getting bogged down in just kind of pointless busy work. And hopefully through this video today, we've kind of shown you how you can do that. But if you're curious, if you want to play around with it yourself, we are offering a free 3-day trial. And in this trial, you are able to get complete access to our tool, to all the sports that we offer, in addition to NFL. I mean, it's a busy time of the year right now. We've got NBA playoffs, we've got MLB, the MLB playoffs are coming up soon. We've got hockey, we've got football, we've got golf. I mean, esports, literally almost everything is running right now. And with one subscription to SaberSim, you get access to all of it, and you can try it all out completely free for 3 days. If you want to check it out, head over to SaberSim.com and you can get started in seconds. So just head over there right now and check that out. But either way, if SaberSim's not right for you, we completely get it. We hope that this video at least gave you a lot of insight into what goes into making winning daily fantasy football lineups. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to check this out. We'll be coming out with more videos throughout the season. I know we've got some showdown videos, some single entry videos, a lot of content coming out. So stay tuned on YouTube. If you're not on our email list already, sign up for that. And then you'll be the first to hear about all this new videos. But if you have any suggestions, any questions at all, you can always reach out to me at andy@sabersim.com. Max and Danny, where are the best places for people to reach out to you guys?
For me, at Max J. Steinberg on Twitter is the best place for me.
Yeah, I am at Daniel Singer S on Twitter.
Perfect. And guys, again, thank you so much for the time. We hope you got a lot out of this. We had a lot of fun making it. So thank you again and good luck this season.